So let's start with this one here. It's the first one chronologically in this new series that you've been doing, although you've been using dolls as a metaphor for some time now. I'd love to hear your thoughts behind this piece.
Yeah, thanks. Well, this piece was a lot of times what happens to me with a piece. I think this is kind of what happens with anybody with you try something new and you don't have the ability of seeing what is going to be contributed to the end result that is not in your conscious plan when you start out. So this was actually starting out as just a traditional nude, a totally different source I had taken and, as we've talked about before, as you get to the point where you've been doing something for years, a skill in particular, and there's always a problem solving, and with painting, that's kind of like the name of the game. You run into these where all the variables begin to line up as you're trying to solve the problem, and you start to see where that's gonna go. And so I was doing the traditional nude, which I'd done many times before, years and years ago, and I could begin to see what the result was gonna be because it wasn't new territory for me, and all of the things that I didn't like about those pieces in the past became more amplified now because I'd already done it, and there were things that bothered me about maybe they were overdone or out of date or whatever it was. And so I started to see all of those elements being what the finished product was going to be like. So I was like, okay, I can't do this. Just painting has got to change directions. And so it was all kinda happening at once and, on, like, the 3rd day of painting, and I could feel it emotionally too. I mean, it was like forcing myself to paint, and I had low energy. Everything was culminating through my body and emotions telling me, "This isn't don't do this?" So, as I was looking for, "Okay, what direction do I wanna take this?" and also having had done all of these other works with different types of dolls, for the Chernobyl series, I thought, "Okay, I know what I'm gonna do," and I had this Barbie, and I'd been kind of playing around with, what Barbie meant, the icon of the doll and all the influence she's had on our culture, so I just sort of started with making moves on her head, and it was funny because normally the head or the face, the expression, if I'm doing a figurative piece, is the most time consuming, and it just came together in a couple hours, and I loved it, and so once that happened and it kind of got me to just release all the details that sometimes I get stuck in if I'm doing an actual person, and I like that freshness. So it just kind of happened organically and very quickly, and it ended up being the perfect solution to the different two different directions. The old direction of traditional figurative work dying and the new direction of using the dolls as a metaphor for the cultural commentary pieces that I've been doing more and more. I've been getting more serious about. So
I love hearing the evolution behind it. And I have seen that initial image. I think you posted it on social of the traditional nude. And I think it's very interesting because it does speak to your work in general, this extremely refined handle on figurative work and how to represent faces, bodies, horses, whatever it might be. But then this other side of wanting to explore a dialogue that is riding on that tradition of painting and representation, however, is very abstract, but it's abstract with a lot of layers beneath it. And I think this piece really captures that dichotomy between where you've been and where you're going.
yeah, I think so. And I've had enough time painting now, really, although it really has come together in the last, well, it had been there for several years, but it's become where I'm very consciously aware of it. What are the elements that I'm the best at and what elements am I not as good at? And it's definitely calligraphic line and the hints of forms and portraiture. It's the expression within portraiture, not traditional portraiture. But I think one of the things that makes my path as a painter a little more unique is that I have the traditional skill base, and then I have the conceptual stuff that's more contemporary, more of a comment about what's happening in our society. And I have to try to make those things work together because my strength is in how I see form and light, which are traditional approaches to form, but conceptually, I'm way out there. And so trying to make them find a relationship, it ends up having a few different equations. One where I have a body of work that is traditional, less and less all the time, and one that is the combination of the two elements. And so it's both separate and overlapping in a couple different ways. And instead of apologizing for it, I'm learning to embrace it because it is what makes my work, I think, what it is.
Yes, it certainly is. And there's the bringing the two together, but there's bringing two together and also allowing them to clash slightly. And that is part of the dialogue. For example, the quality of the flesh in the legs here is very lifelike, and the choice of the cooler shades and your aptitude to use color to really give a mood to something, as opposed to the plasticky bubblegum pink that's in the Barbie. The dichotomy between the two is such an important part of the dialogue that is expressing your concept.
Yeah, thanks. And you're spot on because I'm one who absolutely believes that when we look at abstracted form or you look at anything in anybody's work, your ability to relate to it as a painter when you're doing it or as the viewer, the end piece is based on memory and your experiences. And so if you don't have something in there that you are referencing as you're doing the work, let's just say it's much more it has a stronger emotional component and it has a more meaningful conceptual component, and it's a stronger piece rather than having well, I mean, there's not objective works where, especially with the abstract expressionists, that were really trying to get at what those relationship links were. But for me, I can say something and really hit the target if I have included elements that people can make associations with in their own history.
Yes, certainly. And I think that there is nothing that correlates more directly than the human figure with the human experience. It's something that is just immediately relatable and or unrelatable, but recognizable. And I think coming back to the utilization of your traditional painting skills, the way that you have been able to move in this piece from the solidity and the finished product and effect of her face and the legs to this very suggestive, translucent background where it's almost like the sketch version, but at the same time, it's almost like a mechanism to express things in the past or layers of experience. And so the shoe that's partly there or the eyelashes, which I love, just sitting there on the ground, the way you've utilized that calligraphic line and allowed them to be sketchy like that, in contrast to such a finished kind of element in the middle, really for me is an interesting point in your paintings.
Well, thank you. I found, because I've done it many times, where I have not left, because I considered in this particular piece those elements where they are kind of sketchy and it's suggesting an atmosphere or an environment. If I were to render that fully, there would be too much heaviness and too much static in the piece. And there has to be something for me because there are these rendered elements that can be, because my forms are not fluffy and light, let's just say. And so they have a lot of weight to them. And if I didn't have elements that were atmospheric and undefined, then it's very heavy. It's just very heavy. You can't move yourself around the image. But with those elements, it makes it undefined and a little more surreal where people can fill it in themselves or try to solve it for themselves visually. And that's, I think, the balance that I need to have.
Yeah, and I do love the way that taking that traditional element of composition in painting, you're right, just keeps circulating around from the solidity of, Barbie and seeing that juxtaposition of the fleshy legs to then the pink shoes and back up to the arm in the drawer. And then as I circle around and around, I start to see more and more like I'm focusing in on the blues in her hair, which I didn't see at first. And so there's this something, the very circular sort of a compositional device that you've used there where you just keep coming around and seeing more on each journey around.
Oh, well, that's good to hear. The original photo when I started out to do the traditional nude was a model I had hired, and we did thousands, I think really thousands of pictures that day. And this pose, I love this pose because it was so uncomfortable with that little scissors shake with her leg. So I knew that again, because I've been painting so long, that I knew I needed to have something that was awkward about the figure itself before I even went into it, or it was just gonna be smoking cliche. I couldn't do it. So there's for me, there's always these little turns along the journey as I'm planning it or painting it where I want to have things that are bothersome, you know?
Yeah, yeah, you are right. It is not a comfortable position to sustain. Even just that angle of that foot makes me feel like I'm in a high heel, which to me, like almost torture. I do wear them every now and then, but just that the forming of your foot and the holding of a position in an uncomfortable way because of societal expectations is really captured there. I see that.
Funny.
Anything else you'd like to tell me about this piece in closing?
Well, I think that, well, first of all, it has opened the door for me to use this particular doll for everything that she represents today in our contemporary culture to really explore this storyline. I like the idea of going a little more into these because for me, what she pretty much is talking about is this idea of what is the beauty standard today and how has this childhood doll influenced American beauty, the women's beauty standards. But also, one of the things I really interested in, I'd say this is one of the core building blocks in my work, is how we are influenced and imprinted psychologically when we are very young. And so children's toys have a huge impact, how those kids interact with them, what they think of those toys. I never played with dolls myself. I was a Matchbox car little kid. And so I was one of the few little girls that didn't play with dolls. But as an adult looking back, I do question, all these girls that were in my generation that did play with Barbie. What is that connection? What was that influence on? How many of these women have gone for cosmetic surgery and specifically asked to look like Barbie? You know, and they're not asking to look like other dolls from the past. Nobody wants to look like Raggedy Ann or something. That's
I like that. I had a life-size Raggedy Ann.
so that's really what my work is about for me. And playing around with these surface elements that people can relate to that are funny is just the facade. It's
Mm.
kind of the mirage.
Yeah, it's the tip of the iceberg, and I've seen this in other works of yours where it's like one of those beautiful poisonous flowers where it's amazing that, the prey comes close and gets, like, eaten or something like that.
That was my favorite. Venus flytrap. Those were my favorite little plants. I had one when I was a kid.
Yeah, yeah, it's like that. It's like, "Ooh, look at the beautiful pinks and blues in the Barbie, and what is going on there?"
I mean, that's exactly right. And that's what interests me. That's what fascinates me about life and how we process information. Very few things are as they appear. And our first reaction is to just respond to the surface of how it's presenting itself.
Yeah, our filters are set in a certain way, and it's not necessarily for survival these days. It's been very much influenced, as you suggest in a lot of your work, by our memory and upbringing and the imagery around us.
Yeah. Yeah. So out of her came more exploration with the other, again, using Barbie again and really kind of amplifying that message of how Barbie's beauty ideal has influenced the ideal of beauty today. So I actually had this is another piece. Let's talk about transition in the process on the canvas. So this piece started out, I should send you the photos. It was going to be a traditional Mona Lisa, but I was going to write in red letters across the top, you know, once forgotten. And so I did gold leaf underneath it, and she was I got her face started, and I ran into that roadblock again. And so I put it aside, and all I took, what was flashing ahead of me is I got 7 days it's going to take me to render her face, and I just was like, that's not what matters to me. And a lot of people have done that, made different statements with it. And so then I just slowly started replacing her elements with Barbie's elements. And so she made a transformation under that surface level. She looks a lot, there's a week and a half of her changing form. And I finally got to the place of what I was really trying to say.
I love knowing that. And of course, for those who are familiar with their art historical references, the hands are still there. And again, that contrast between you've really highlighted the bluish, yellowish kind of qualities that are in Da Vinci's Mona Lisa painting. And then the plasticness of those breasts. It's so plastic. And the contrast between the two is, again, it's such a strong comment.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, and I've tried to think a little bit ahead of, right now you see more and more people that do have, and I'm not ruling myself out. I'm getting to the point where I want to find a little place with myself. But where more and more women are doing cosmetic surgery, that's today. What's tomorrow going to be? And that is kind of scary, where if we are not really consciously aware of the influences that cause women to make those decisions, and sometimes not always the best decisions, then where does it stop?
And I think we all know the answer to that. It doesn't stop. And I love the way you've kind of reflected this plugged in element here, in terms of like how much are we going to rely on external energy and input for our own identities. And there are instances where it is a good thing. I can think of plenty. However, at the same time, there are plenty of circumstances where it's done for reasons that undermine the person making the decision rather than empowering them. And I think that that idea of them being plugged in and propped up and maybe making those decisions unconsciously without really understanding either the repercussions or the basis for making that decision are things that really need to be considered. Everything moves so fast. Most of us don't take time to think about these things.
Yeah, and especially for women. I mean, even though there are plenty of men that are doing plastic surgery too, and that's not, of course, the real point of the piece. The real point of the piece is how we process information and our need to fit in until we get to a certain place in our development, in our lives.
Yeah. And is it a choice made freely or is it a band aid to try to fix something else deeper?
Yeah, exactly.
Tell me about your decision. Like we've spoken about you leaving suggestive sort of marks, your choices on the viewer's left there.
Oh, the hair, that wig form. Yeah, so again, I was trying to paint the story of how these different elements that we associate with as the ideal beauty standard kind of gotten shed over the years. Like the blonde hair is associated with being, you know, more of a beauty standard than having dark hair. I mean, at least that's sort of the stereotypical thing. And so that's a wig form and her old dark hair on the side.
Oh,
I knew that was a little hard to read, but I wanted it to be close to being completely. I wanted it on that line of some people are going to get it and some people might not get it, because I didn't want to give too much away. But so that was her old dark hair, and then of course she starts to light up. As we move into the future and the cord, and then whether or not we even need the electricity. So it's that history of step by step going towards that wherever it ends up.
yeah, that's a good point. In a way, the electric cord is starting to look antiquated, isn't it?
Yeah. So I was happy with this piece because I thought she was pretty simply done and just kind of highlighted what I was trying to get at. Even though expression and portraiture is one of my strengths, there's so much weight in doing an actual person. You see all these artists now, especially painters, that they're painting their friends or they're painting, just whoever they can get their hands on. And for a viewer to be able to relate to that, aside from the skill the artist is showing, it has to be about that subject's experience because they don't know the person. If it's just a random person, the artist has to do a really bang up job of saying what they're trying to get across. What is it about that subject? What is it about the pose, the gesture, the color palette? Go through all the formal elements, all the conceptual elements that's really contributing something. What is the artist trying to get at? And so that makes it hard, not impossible. The German expressionists did a fabulous job with that. But it does make it harder to use an individual person that's an unknown, especially depending on what kind of say is a painter. And then if you use like Alex Katz has done, where he's used a group of people, a demographic of people and their lifestyle and what they have experienced as a result of what they've been trying to seek in their lifestyle, how, kind of this empty life, it's expressionless group of people. He's done it quite successfully with that little statement that he's making with that type of you don't have to know who they are because he gives it away with, a number of different elements, the setting or whatever. But it can be very difficult. As I've done political individuals before, and of course that opens up other, issues depending on what people's political views are, and they can miss the point of what I'm trying to get across. And so I found that for my work, when I'm really talking about the human experience and psychology, how we're imprinted, how we process information, I can get much closer to what I'm trying to say by using a doll, especially if I'm really paying attention to which doll. I mean, I may move on from dolls. I may find other ways of doing this, but the Chernobyl dolls were perfect. I really researched what type of doll was being used in Ukraine at the time of the explosion because they weren't getting everything. The dolls that were on site in 1986 were the dolls that were being marketed in the United States in the 70s. So I found a whole bunch of those on eBay. Of course, those have connotations in themselves. So I couldn't use them for what I'm trying to say now about these other things I'm trying to talk about. And so Barbie's perfect for me right now. And I have a number of different pieces planned, but I do like that it's lacks an individual identity. This fits perfectly for me right now.
Yeah, it's a universal identity in many ways that people might like or dislike, but it's symbolic.
Yeah, exactly. Symbolic without being stylized because I don't like stylized figures because I think they often use stylization or generalization of form, and it ends up being insensitive to what they're really trying to say. And so, for that reason, I don't like so it was kind of a surprise to me, that said, because these dolls don't have they don't have individual wrinkles, So you could think of them as being sort of stylized, but it ends up not feeling that way at all. In fact, I mean, her face, as simple as it looks, took me a week to do, which is unusual for me. I'm fast. But everything had to be exactly the way I wanted it to be.
I can see that. And there is a sort of a pressure in painting something so recognized that you have to,
Yeah.
at first glance, go, there's no doubt. Like, you don't even question who she is.
And then that was another thing is we all have this image of Barbie in our mind. You pick up a Barbie at Walmart and her face is a little different. If you pay $11 for her versus $21, her face is different. And you're like, I can't, the $11 Barbie is not what I'm after. And Barbie with different hair. I mean, I tried doing her with dark hair before I started working out all these other elements and doesn't look like Barbie as much. And it's funny.
Yeah, there's an imprint, there's a social imprint there of that.
Yeah, there definitely is. So on this piece behind me, if you want to talk about the moon landing one next, this piece was kind of a merger between some of these storylines and narratives that are going on culturally right now. And to me, they're super fun to play with. I don't know how many of these in my mind kind of jumping around like sugar plums. I don't want to paint this, I want to paint that. And so I had never, I mean, I heard whispers of this, they call it a conspiracy theory. I don't really like that term conspiracy theory because I think it's kind of like clinical evidence where it turns out to be true most of the time. But I hadn't really heard that much. I've heard whisperings that some people think that the Apollo moon landing wasn't real. And I was like, no kidding. I mean, I never even thought about it. And so I started watching some videos on it on YouTube from different points of view and some podcasts about it. And I thought this would be super fun to do with Barbie. And it would give me, I had taken these, I actually took the pictures of the doll of Barbie almost a year before I did the painting, before I even thought about doing the moon landing one. I thought this is perfect because everybody that is in the camp of the Apollo moon landing did not happen believes that everything was staged in Hollywood and the astronaut who was taking the picture of himself with the flag. And so in some of these videos that I was watching on YouTube explaining why people think it was fake, one of them was, oh, that the shadows weren't all parallel. Well, I've done enough photographs in my, if you get light from a couple different sources or depending on whether you get different type of lens, it can look like they're not going parallel. And so I thought, okay, we're going to play with this. So we're going to have shadows that are all over the place. And, talking about how the flag was waving and there was just all these different things. And, I, yeah, I mean, I can see the argument. I really kind of felt like it didn't, there was a single one that really ruled out that it was real for me, you know? I think the one thing that I felt like was their best argument was that it was during the Cold War and there was all kinds of stuff that was being done that was to present, with our race against the USSR.
And so this is really an interesting topic because more and more as we see AI present images where we really don't know if things are real or not,
Yeah.
uh, it's sort of like a bit of a satire, a bit of a parody of this concept. There's always going to be people that question if something's real or not. And then there's always the perspective of one, does it matter? And two, like, where is that person coming from? What's their agenda in thinking that it didn't exist? And so it's going to be a territory that we're going to have to navigate more and more of this. Like, did it really happen? Is it really real?
Yeah, exactly. And it fits right into what interests me anyway, because all of this work that I've been doing since it started in 2017 was because, as you know, I had 4 years of my life way back in the early 2000s where, you know, when I was married, I thought my life was one thing. I mean, I thought I understood what my life was. I thought I knew who the people were that I was dealing with. And I had struggled with illness for 4 years. And then back in 2016 is when I found out what source and the cause was. And it was so shocking. Every single morning I woke up for I bet 6 months. And it was like a shock because you wake up and everything floods to your mind about what you're going to do that day, where you are, and you're like, what's the agenda for the day? And it came with this shock because it was a realization of, what had my past had actually been. And so that's what really made me fascinated. Now I know what to look for. I know why I was played or fooled or taken advantage of. I knew all the elements that contributed to that for me. But if you don't have a situation like that in your life, I remember seeing this guy, it was a Dateline show, and he had been the victim of a crime, this young boy. And the interviewer said to him, how do you feel about knowing this knowledge that this happened? And he said, "Y- the reason you can't solve it in the beginning is because we are raised in an environment in our culture to think that certain constructs are are the human experience. Certain things happen and certain things don't happen. And certain things can happen to you in your context of not you particularly, but any person in the context of their daily lives. But other things only happen in the movies, in Hollywood, in other countries, in whatever. And those things are not a possibility. And when you find out that whoever told you there were limitations on what your experience really was, didn't know what the freak they were talking about. And so once I realized that if you were to solve a problem, and this can be in any, it can be in medicine where your doctor's trying to diagnose somebody, it can be in so many other aspects of something somebody's trying to solve. But I think of it in particular in science. If you don't entertain every possibility that looks like it could fit, if you shut out a whole group of variables because they're unlikely or that couldn't possibly be, or what are the chances of that? You're very likely not going to find the answer, or certainly not in a number of cases. And so I think that every day when we go through life and we're interacting with all different kinds of personalities, we're making choices based on what our assumptions are. You have to open your horizons about what these variables actually are. And so that's what really drives my work. And so working with something like really fun and cute and satirical and popular with something like the moon landing that, I don't even want to try to solve that one myself, but it's a fun, humorous way to deal with a very heavy topic. That is what I'm interested in.
Mm. Yeah, well said. And it is so true. And I think that is the power of art in general is to create worlds, universes, relationships, so you can see things in new ways and consider that maybe things can be imagined in a completely different way to the social paradigm we are used to.
Yep. So, of course, I thought it was fun to kind of use her in her selfie position because, there's all kinds of little layers to the influencer role. And I'm very interested in using pink, on a formal level just because it elevates everything and makes it more fun. I have turned a corner in the last year with my work because I'm dealing with a topic that's very heavy and could be very dark or could be very ominous or hard for some people to digest. And so I found, first of all, it's a lot more fun for me to do it in a way that's really much more tongue in cheek. It's kind of like swallowing the pill with the honey, like you talk about with the sugar and sweet.
Also, it's a cultural thread of storytelling that has persisted through the ages in terms of using these archetypes in combinations with scenarios to reveal truths and stories.
Yeah. It's why I love Richard Prince's work so much. It's why I really love this idea of appropriation or just doing appropriation is because you can take everything from the original source element, everything that comes with it that's attached to it, all of our associations and all of its history, and you can just transfer, like download it into your storyline and you could suddenly say what you're trying to say and in a funny way. And so I love that approach.
It is interesting. And I think that makes me think of like historically, look across a lot of ancient civilizations and the imagery used this idea of bricolage, like using concrete symbols to tell complex stories and concepts. So, it might be birds and animals or, different elements that were familiar and of this earth in combination to then tell the stories is like the modern version of bricolage.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, every culture has that. I mean, there are countries, of course, in the Middle East where they're not allowed to use certain types of forms in their work. And so symbols and patterns mean more to them and how they were raised in the imagery that they were exposed to. So, culturally, those different elements can mean a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this is a fantastic piece. So fun. And I have to say, the Space Cowboy, I love him.
Well, it was gonna be Ken because I thought, well, this would be really fun to kind of push the idea that it's all happening in the Hollywood studio, and so Ken doll, if you buy the Ken doll from the movie, he's not just 21.95. I mean, he's like $60 right now, and so I thought, well, I can use a photo of Ken doll, and so I painted him in kinda leaning around the corner like, he's waiting for Barbie to get done with her photo shoot, and I ended up just loving the shadow way more than the doll head.
I like the shadow choice. Well, thank you so much for sharing your insight into these three fabulous new pieces. I look forward to sharing this with everyone.
Well, thanks so much for talking about it. I appreciate it.